Blood soaked through the entire left side of her hip, spreading in a slow dark stain across the snow beneath her. The bullet had torn through her ribs, and every breath she pulled into her lungs felt like a blade dragging across raw nerve. In front of her, more than 300 enemy soldiers were climbing the ridge, spreading out through the pines like a rising tide. Behind her lay the only road left open for an entire battalion to retreat. The radio had gone silent hours ago. Every soldier who had once fought beside her already believed she was dead. Then came a single shot, then a second, then 10 more, one after another, steady as a heartbeat. Enemy soldiers began collapsing along the ridge, one by one, and nobody could explain why. No one knew that the bleeding woman lying in the snow had held that entire front line by herself for nearly 8 hours, until the rescue team finally found her behind a rifle that was still warm to the touch. The soldiers who served in that outpost called her Ghost Raven. It was winter, and the mountains around the forward base were buried under snow that never seemed to melt, cutting the world down to white ridgelines and gray sky. Captain Rachel Monroe was the finest sniper the unit had ever fielded, though almost nobody could say they truly knew her. She rarely spoke unless she had something worth saying, and she never spoke about herself at all. The younger recruits only knew the stories that were passed from bunk to bunk in the dark, whispered like something half sacred. If Ghost Raven is out there, the squad comes home. That line had been repeated so many times across so many deployments that it had stopped sounding like an exaggeration and started sounding like a fact. Rachel never wore her achievements the way other soldiers did. She had no medals pinned to her chest, no stories told over drinks, no interviews given to anyone who asked. When a newly arrived captain scoffed and called her reputation nothing more than exaggerated rumor, dismissing years of quiet, disciplined killing as folklore invented by bored soldiers, the men around him simply exchanged a look and said nothing. They had seen what she could do, and they knew better than to argue with results. The base itself sat on a windswept plateau surrounded by 3 separate mountain ranges, a strategic outpost that guarded one of the few reliable supply corridors through the region. Winters there were brutal even by military standards, with temperatures dropping low enough to freeze equipment solid and turn simple patrols into tests of endurance. Soldiers rotated through the post in shifts of 6 months at a time, most of them counting down the days until they could return to warmer postings elsewhere. Rachel had been stationed there far longer than anyone else, choosing to extend her deployment again and again for reasons she never fully explained to her commanding officers. Some believed she simply had nowhere else she wanted to be, no family waiting for her return, no home that called to her the way it seemed to call everyone else. Others believed the mountains themselves had become something she needed, a place harsh and unforgiving enough to match the discipline she demanded of herself every single day. Whatever the reason, her presence had become woven into the identity of the outpost itself, a fixed point around which everything else seemed to orbit. New commanding officers arrived every year or two, but Ghost Raven remained constant as the mountains surrounding the base. Rachel had grown up far from any battlefield, in a small town where winters were long and the woods were dense enough to swallow a person whole. Her father had taught her to shoot before she was 10 years old, patiently walking her through breath control and trigger discipline on quiet mornings when the frost still clung to the grass. She never imagined that skill would one day carry her across deserts, jungles, and frozen mountain ridges, keeping other people's sons and daughters alive, one careful shot at a time. By the time she joined the military, she already understood something most recruits took years to learn. Patience mattered more than aggression, and stillness could be its own kind of weapon. Her file, the parts of it that were not sealed, read like a list of missions most soldiers only heard about secondhand. Extractions under fire, counter-sniper duels that lasted for days, a confirmed kill at a distance most marksmen would call impossible. And yet Rachel carried none of that as pride. She carried it as weight, the kind that settled into the shoulders and never fully left. The kind that showed itself only in the way she scanned every room for exits, the instant she entered it, the way she slept lightly, even in the safest of barracks. An old injury from years earlier had left a permanent ache low in her back, a souvenir from a mission gone wrong that she never discussed. On cold mornings the pain flared sharp enough to steal her breath, yet she never once let it slow her down or excuse her from a single patrol. She simply adjusted, recalibrated, and kept moving forward, the way she had trained herself to do with everything else in her life. Doctors who examined her over the years had quietly recommended medical discharge more than once, citing the cumulative damage that a decade of hard deployments had left etched into her body. Rachel declined every single time, signing waivers and passing fitness evaluations through sheer force of will when her body alone might not have carried her through. She never explained her reasons to anyone who asked, though those closest to her suspected the truth ran deeper than simple stubbornness. Somewhere along the way, the mission had stopped being a job she performed and had become the only language she still knew how to speak fluently. The younger soldiers noticed these things even if she never spoke of them. They noticed how she always positioned herself near a window with a clear line of sight, how her eyes swept a room within seconds of entering it, how she carried her rifle the way other people carried their own hands, as something that had simply become part of her body. Slowly, without ever intending to, she had become the quiet center of gravity for the entire outpost, the person junior soldiers looked toward without even realizing they were doing it. Sergeant Marcus Bell, who had served alongside her for nearly 3 years, once told a newer soldier that watching Rachel prepare for a mission was like watching a machine calibrate itself. She checked her rifle twice, then a third time out of habit rather than necessity. She studied maps until the terrain existed behind her eyes, even in darkness, memorizing elevation changes and potential firing lines with the same care most people reserved for memorizing a face. Nothing about her preparation ever looked rushed, and nothing about her execution ever looked uncertain. That reputation had been built through years of missions that rarely made it into any official record accessible to soldiers below a certain rank. There had been a rescue operation in dense jungle terrain, where she held off an ambush for 6 hours while wounded soldiers were evacuated one by one. There had been a counter-sniper duel against an enemy marksman considered among the deadliest in the region, a contest of patience and nerve that ended only when Rachel outlasted him by nearly 11 hours of near-total stillness. Each mission added another layer to the legend without her ever confirming or denying a single detail. The mission that would change everything began as something almost routine. Command needed eyes on an enemy supply route running through the valley below the ridge, a simple reconnaissance task meant to confirm troop movement before the next planning cycle. 12 special operations soldiers were assigned to the patrol, moving quietly through the tree line under cover of low cloud and falling snow. Rachel went with them as designated Overwatch, tasked with providing long-range support if anything went wrong along the route. For the first several hours, everything unfolded exactly as expected. The forest was silent except for the crunch of boots and fresh powder and the occasional distant hum of a vehicle engine far below. The squad leader, a steady sergeant named Marcus Bell, kept the pace deliberate and careful, checking his team's spacing every few hundred meters. Rachel took position on a rocky outcrop overlooking the valley, settling into the stillness that had always come naturally to her, letting her breathing slow until it matched the rhythm of the wind moving through the pines. The 11 soldiers moving through the trees below her were younger, most of them barely into their mid-20s, still carrying the particular kind of confidence that came from never having faced a fight they could not win. Rachel had watched enough young soldiers rotate through the outpost to recognize the signs of that confidence for what it was: a useful tool in training and a dangerous liability in the field. She kept a careful count of their positions as they moved, cross-referencing it against the terrain features she had memorized before the mission ever began. Nothing about the valley below suggested danger yet, but Rachel had learned long ago that the quietest terrain often hid the most dangerous secrets, and she kept her scope moving across the tree line with patient, methodical discipline. Through her scope, the valley looked ordinary at first, just a scattering of trucks moving along a narrow dirt road toward a supply depot in the distance. But something about the pattern felt wrong to her, a wrongness she could not immediately name but had learned over years of experience never to ignore. She adjusted her position, widened her field of view, and began counting more carefully, tracking vehicles that kept appearing from behind a ridge that should have been empty. What she found made her stomach tighten in a way it rarely did anymore. This was not a handful of supply trucks moving cargo through a quiet valley. This was an entire mechanized brigade, armored vehicles, and troop transports stretching back farther than she could see, at least 300 soldiers moving with the coordinated precision of a unit preparing for a major offensive. If that force reached the ridge and continued forward, the entire forward base and every soldier stationed there would be surrounded within hours, cut off with no route of retreat and no way to call for reinforcement in time. Rachel radioed the discovery back to command immediately, keeping her voice level even as her pulse quickened beneath her calm exterior. She relayed troop estimates, vehicle counts, and likely arrival times with the precision of someone who understood exactly how much depended on getting the numbers right. Command's response came back within minutes, sharp and unambiguous. Withdraw immediately. Every soldier on that ridge needed to be moving toward the extraction route before the enemy brigade closed the distance, and there was no time left to debate the order. The squad began its retreat at once, moving fast through the trees while trying to stay hidden beneath the cover of the falling snow. For a while, it seemed as though they might slip away unnoticed, the enemy column too far below to spot 12 figures moving quietly through white forest. But luck rarely held on nights like that one, and somewhere along the ridge, a scout or a drone or simple bad fortune gave their position away. Within minutes, the silence of the mountain shattered into gunfire tearing through the pine trees around them. Hundreds of rounds ripped through branches and kicked up sprays of snow as the squad sprinted toward a narrow footbridge spanning a deep ravine, the only crossing point between them and the safety of friendly lines. One by one, the soldiers scrambled across the icy planks, boots slipping on frozen wood while enemy fire chased them from behind. Engineers had rigged the bridge with explosives days earlier, meant to be detonated the instant the last soldier crossed, cutting off any pursuit and buying the retreating unit precious time. But the detonator had jammed, or the timing had gone wrong, or the wiring had been damaged by stray gunfire. Nobody would ever be entirely certain which. What mattered in that moment was simple and brutal. If the enemy force reached that bridge before it could be destroyed, they would pour across it in overwhelming numbers, and every soldier retreating along that route would be caught in the open with nowhere left to run. Rachel understood the mathematics of the situation faster than anyone else on that ridge. Someone needed to hold the enemy back long enough for the engineers to fix the detonator, or long enough for the rest of the squad to reach safety and call in support. The engineer working frantically at the base of the bridge, a young corporal named David Ortiz, kept shouting updates over the chaos of gunfire, insisting he needed just a few more minutes to reroute the damaged wiring. Every minute felt like an hour under those circumstances, with enemy rounds chewing through the tree line and soldiers dragging wounded comrades toward whatever cover they could find. Sergeant Bell was already coordinating the squad's fallback positions, trying to buy Ortiz the time he needed without losing anyone else in the process. It was clear to everyone present that the math simply did not favor them, not with 300 soldiers closing the distance, and only minutes of daylight remaining before the situation became unrecoverable. She looked at Sergeant Bell, who was already shaking his head before she finished speaking, already understanding exactly what she intended to do and hating every part of it. "I will hold them," she said, her voice quiet but absolute, carrying none of the fear that any reasonable person would have felt in that moment. Bell argued, insisting they find another way, insisting no single soldier could hold back a force that size for any meaningful length of time. Rachel did not argue back. She simply turned, moved back toward the tree line overlooking the enemy advance, and settled into position, leaving the rest of the squad no choice but to keep moving without her. She was alone on that ridge as the first wave of enemy soldiers crested the rise below her, dark shapes moving fast through the falling snow. Rachel took a slow breath, steadied her rifle against a fallen log, and fired the first shot of what would become an 8-hour siege that no training manual could have ever prepared her for. The bullet found its mark instantly, and the soldier in front dropped without a sound, vanishing into the white ground like he had never existed at all. From that moment forward, everything became rhythm: fire, move, reload, fire again. She never stayed in one position long enough for the enemy to triangulate her location, shifting between outcroppings and fallen trees with a fluidity that made it look almost effortless. Though every movement cost her strength, she could not afford to lose. An entire platoon found itself pinned down along that ridge, unable to advance, convinced they were facing a coordinated sniper team rather than a single exhausted woman working alone in the snow. That confusion became her greatest weapon. Officers on the enemy side began shouting conflicting reports over their radios, certain they were under fire from multiple directions at once, certain there had to be at least 4 or 5 shooters hidden somewhere in the tree line. Rachel let them believe it. She fired from one position, then sprinted low through the brush to another vantage point 50 meters away, firing again before the enemy could even process where the first shot had originated. It was exhausting, brutal work, but it was working. Then came the moment that changed everything. A stray round, fired blindly into the tree line during a moment of panic, tore through her left side just above the hip, the impact spinning her half around before she managed to catch herself against a boulder. Pain exploded through her body in a way that made the world tilt sideways for several seconds, hot and blinding and impossible to ignore. Blood began soaking through her jacket almost instantly, dark and steady, pooling beneath her in the snow. Any ordinary person would have gone down in that moment, would have curled around the wound and waited for help that might never come. Rachel gritted her teeth, forced air back into her lungs, and kept her eye pressed against the scope. She would not leave that ridge, not while the bridge remained standing and the squad remained within reach of enemy fire. The wound could wait. The mission could not. What followed was the most brutal stretch of the entire siege, a slow and grinding battle of endurance fought as much against her own failing body as against the soldiers advancing below her. Between shots, Rachel worked with shaking hands to pack the wound with gauze, cinching a strip of cloth tight enough to slow the bleeding. Though nothing could stop it completely, she injected herself with a dose of morphine from her medical kit, just enough to dull the worst of the pain without dulling the sharpness she needed to keep firing accurately. The cold that had once been her enemy became, in strange fashion, one of her only allies during those hours, slowing the bleeding just enough to keep her conscious even as it threatened to steal the feeling from her fingers entirely. She learned to work around the pain rather than fight it directly, breathing through each wave as it came and using the brief moments of clarity between waves to line up her next shot. Every sound on that ridge seemed magnified by the stillness of the falling snow, the crack of distant gunfire, the whine of a bullet passing too close overhead, the low murmur of enemy voices calling out positions that no longer existed by the time anyone reached them. Every few minutes she dragged herself through the snow to a new position, leaving a faint red trail behind her that she desperately hoped the enemy would not notice in the chaos of battle. The cold worked strangely in her favor and against her all at once, numbing the pain in her side just enough to keep her functional while also threatening to steal the strength from her limbs entirely. She rationed her ammunition with the discipline of someone who understood exactly how many rounds she had left and exactly how many more shots she would need to fire before this was over. The enemy adapted their tactics as the hours dragged on, growing increasingly desperate to break the deadlock holding their advance in place. A reconnaissance drone buzzed overhead, sweeping its camera across the tree line in search of the sniper who had turned an entire brigade into a stalled and frightened mess. Mortar rounds began falling across the ridge, throwing up geysers of snow and shattered wood as officers tried to blast her out of hiding through sheer volume rather than precision. Rachel watched the drone's flight pattern and used it against them, timing her movements to slip beneath its camera angle each time it swept past. When mortar fire began targeting her previous position, she was already 200 meters away, tucked into a shallow depression behind a cluster of boulders, calmly lining up her next shot. Dogs were brought up from somewhere in the enemy column, handlers trying to track her scent through the blood-soaked snow, but the falling weather and her own careful movement kept them chasing shadows for far longer than anyone expected. By the fourth hour, her body had begun betraying her in ways no amount of discipline could fully mask. Her fingers had turned stiff from cold and blood loss, forcing her to warm them briefly against her chest between shots just to maintain the fine control her rifle demanded. Frost had formed along the edges of her scope, and she cleared it with the sleeve of her jacket every few minutes, aware that even a fraction of a second's delay could cost her the shot and possibly her life. She rationed sips of water from a canteen that had begun to freeze at its edges, forcing herself to stay hydrated even as every instinct told her to simply lie still and let exhaustion take over. Twice, she nearly blacked out from the combination of blood loss and cold, catching herself each time by focusing on the sound of her own heartbeat, counting the beats until her vision cleared enough to keep working. Heavy machine gun fire eventually joined the assault, tearing through the tree line in long sustained bursts meant to suppress any possible firing position along the ridge. Rachel pressed herself flat against frozen earth as bark and splinters rained down around her, wading through the worst of it before rising just long enough to put a single round through the gunner's position. The gun fell silent immediately, and for a moment the entire ridge seemed to hold its breath, uncertain what had just happened or how one shooter could keep finding targets with such devastating consistency. Whispers began spreading through the enemy ranks, passed from soldier to soldier in increasingly frightened tones. Some swore there had to be at least 10 snipers hidden across the mountainside, coordinating their fire with impossible precision. An officer relayed this exact claim up the chain of command, insisting the ridge was defended by an entire specialized unit, rather than a single wounded woman refusing to retreat. Nobody wanted to be the one to challenge that assumption, not when the evidence of dead soldiers scattered across the snow made the theory feel entirely plausible. The truth, captured only briefly on drone footage, that nobody on the enemy side properly analyzed until much later, showed something far more remarkable and far more terrifying than any specialized unit could have been. It showed one woman, alone, bleeding steadily from a wound that should have ended the fight hours earlier, moving between firing positions with a discipline that bordered on inhuman. She never panicked, she never wasted a shot, and she never once considered abandoning the ridge, no matter how much her body begged her to. A young enemy conscript, barely out of basic training, would later tell his own commanding officer that he had watched 3 of his closest friends fall within the span of a single minute, each shot fired from a different angle, each one landing with the same terrible precision. He described the ridge as though it were haunted, insisting that no living person could account for the speed and accuracy of what he had witnessed that afternoon. His account spread quickly through the ranks below him, growing more exaggerated with each retelling, until soldiers who had never fired a single shot toward the ridge found themselves just as frightened as the ones who had faced her fire directly. That fear, more than any tactical calculation, began to work against the enemy advance in ways their commanders never anticipated. Soldiers who had marched confidently up the mountain hours earlier now hesitated at the edge of the tree line, unwilling to advance into a killing field they no longer understood. Morale that had been strong at the start of the assault began fraying at the edges, soldiers whispering among themselves that something on that ridge was simply not natural, that no ordinary person could keep fighting through wounds that severe. Command on the enemy side grew increasingly frustrated with the delay, aware that every hour spent stalled on that ridge was an hour the retreating battalion used to regroup and prepare defenses elsewhere. They needed the advance to continue, and they needed whatever was holding their soldiers back eliminated. An artillery officer, positioned safely behind the front lines, began coordinating a barrage meant to clear the entire ridge with overwhelming force, confident that no single shooter could survive concentrated shelling. Rachel understood immediately what that meant the moment she spotted the artillery officer through her scope, standing at a forward observation point roughly 1,800 meters down the valley. If he successfully called in that barrage, it would not only end her resistance, it would obliterate the retreat route the battalion was still using to reach safety. There was no time to hesitate and no room for a second attempt. She had exactly one shot to make this work, at a distance most marksmen would consider a fantasy rather than a real possibility. The wind was shifting unpredictably across the valley, snow falling thick enough to distort visibility, and her hands were trembling slightly from blood loss and cold in ways that should have made the shot impossible. Rachel forced herself to slow everything down, drawing on years of training that had become as instinctive as breathing itself. She calculated wind speed by watching how the falling snow curved across her field of view. She adjusted for temperature, for the slight downward angle of the shot, for the drop a bullet would experience across nearly 2 miles of open air. In that stretch of silence before the shot, her mind drifted briefly, unbidden, to every range she had ever trained on, every instructor who had ever told her that distance like this belonged to theory rather than practice. She thought of her father's voice from all those years earlier, calm and patient, telling her that a rifle only ever did what the person behind it asked of it, nothing more and nothing less. She pushed the thought aside as quickly as it arrived, aware that sentiment had no place in a calculation this precise, that the only thing that mattered now was the space between one heartbeat and the next. She exhaled slowly, found the space between heartbeats that every good sniper learns to live inside, and squeezed the trigger with a steadiness that defied everything her body was currently enduring. The bullet traveled for nearly 3 full seconds before it reached its target, an eternity measured in heartbeats for anyone waiting to see if the shot would land. It struck true, and the artillery officer collapsed instantly, the barrage he had been coordinating dissolving into confusion and shouted contradictory orders among the soldiers left behind. That single shot bought the retreating battalion precious additional time they used to put real distance between themselves and the stalled enemy advance. Word of the impossible kill spread quickly among the soldiers on the ridge, deepening the fear that had already begun taking root in their ranks. Whatever was up there, waiting in the snow with a rifle that never seemed to miss, had just proven itself capable of things that should not have been possible for any human being, wounded or not. But that shot had cost Rachel dearly, draining reserves of strength and focus she desperately needed for whatever came next. Blood loss was catching up with her in ways she could no longer ignore, her vision blurring at the edges, her hearing dulled to a persistent ringing that made it hard to judge distance by sound alone. The morphine had worn off entirely, leaving raw and grinding pain radiating from her side with every movement she made. Her ammunition supply had dwindled to just a handful of rounds, forcing her to make every remaining shot count in ways that felt increasingly impossible given her deteriorating condition. The enemy, sensing weakness in the pause following that devastating shot, began organizing a coordinated push meant to finally overwhelm the ridge and eliminate whatever resistance remained there. Soldiers spread out along the tree line, preparing to advance from multiple directions at once, determined to end this standoff no matter the cost. Rachel watched them through a scope that kept sliding in and out of focus, her breathing shallow and uneven, every fiber of her body screaming for her to simply stop and let the darkness take her. She did not stop. She forced herself upright against the boulder that had become her final defensive position, checked her remaining ammunition one more time, and prepared to hold the line for as long as her body would allow. It was in that moment, against every reasonable expectation, that her radio crackled back to life, static giving way to a familiar voice calling her name across the frequency. Command had re-established contact, and the first question they asked carried a weight that made her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with her wound. "Ghost Raven, do you copy? Are you still alive out there?" The voice on the other end sounded almost afraid to hope for a positive answer, given how long the silence had stretched and how grim the reports from the retreating squad had made the situation sound. Rachel pressed the radio to her lips, forcing steadiness into a voice that felt increasingly distant even to herself. "They still have not crossed the bridge," she said, her words simple and direct, carrying none of the pain or exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her. That single sentence was the last transmission command received from her position for the remainder of the engagement. The radio went silent again shortly after, whether from damage, dying batteries, or something worse. Nobody on the receiving end could say for certain. What they did know was that reinforcements were finally moving, air support scrambling toward the coordinates she had provided hours earlier, ground forces racing to close the distance before it was too late to matter. The counterattack arrived just as the sun began sinking toward the western ridgeline, painting the snow in shades of orange and deep blue that felt almost too beautiful for the devastation scattered across the mountainside. Fighter aircraft swept low over the valley, forcing the enemy column into a hasty and disorganized retreat that abandoned much of their equipment along the way. Ground reinforcements pushed up the same ridge Rachel had defended alone for nearly 8 hours, and what they found waiting for them left even the most hardened soldiers among them speechless. More than 100 enemy soldiers lay scattered across the snow, many of them positioned in ways that revealed the precision and discipline behind every single shot fired. Vehicles smoked in the distance, abandoned in the chaos of the retreat, their crews having fled rather than risk another encounter with whatever had been waiting on that mountainside. The enemy brigade that had marched up that ridge with overwhelming confidence had been forced into a full withdrawal, their offensive shattered by resistance nobody could have predicted from a single wounded sniper. The reinforcements found Rachel exactly where she had made her final stand, slumped against the same boulder she had used for cover during those last desperate hours. Her hand still rested against the trigger of her rifle, frozen in position as though she had been preparing to fire one final shot even as consciousness slipped away from her. Blood had soaked through the snow around her in a wide dark circle, much of it already frozen solid in the bitter cold. For a long, terrible moment, every soldier who reached her believed they were looking at a body rather than a survivor. The scene surrounding her told its own story before anyone spoke a single word. Spent shell casings lay scattered across 3 separate positions along the ridge, each cluster marking a place where she had fought until the enemy came too close, then dragged herself somewhere new to keep fighting. A trail of blood and disturbed snow connected each of those positions, tracing the full path of her retreat and resistance across nearly 200 meters of brutal terrain. One of the younger soldiers in the rescue party, seeing the distance she had covered while bleeding that badly, simply sat down in the snow and wept, unable to process what the evidence in front of him was telling him about human endurance. Then her eyes opened, slowly, struggling against the weight of exhaustion and blood loss that had nearly claimed her entirely. The soldiers around her froze, uncertain whether to celebrate or simply stare in disbelief at what they were witnessing. Rachel's first words, spoken in a voice barely above a whisper, were not about her own survival or her own suffering. "Did the bridge hold?" she asked, her focus even in that moment fixed entirely on the mission rather than herself. They rushed her to emergency medical care as quickly as the terrain would allow, loading her onto a stretcher while a combat medic worked frantically to stabilize the bleeding that had nearly claimed her life. The journey back to base felt impossibly long to everyone involved, each mile marked by quiet prayers from soldiers who had heard the legend of Ghost Raven for years but had never expected to see her carried out on a stretcher, barely clinging to consciousness. Doctors at the field hospital worked through the night and into the following day, fighting to repair damage that had gone untreated for far too many hours. Rachel underwent multiple surgeries over the following weeks, her body slowly healing from a wound that should have ended her fighting days entirely. Recovery was slow and often painful, filled with long stretches of physical therapy and quiet frustration as she relearned movements that had once come naturally to her. Through it all, she remained largely silent about what had happened on that ridge, deflecting questions from doctors and fellow soldiers alike with the same quiet reserve that had always defined her. Sergeant Bell visited her often during those long weeks of recovery, sitting beside her hospital bed in silence more often than in conversation, understanding better than anyone the particular kind of quiet she needed. He told her once, in a rare unguarded moment, that the entire squad had spent the walk back to base convinced they were leaving her behind to die, and that not one of them had been able to forgive themselves for following her order. Rachel only shook her head slowly, telling him there had been nothing else for any of them to do, that the order had been the only choice that made sense given the situation. It was one of the longest conversations anyone at that hospital ever heard her have. And even then, she spoke more about the bridge holding than about anything she herself had endured. Once the mission reports were eventually declassified, the full scope of what she had accomplished became clear to everyone who read them. A single soldier had held back an advancing force of roughly 300 enemy troops entirely alone, defending a critical retreat route for nearly 8 consecutive hours despite suffering a severe combat wound early in the engagement. She had eliminated multiple high-value tactical targets, including an artillery officer at a distance most snipers would call theoretically impossible, disrupting enemy coordination at a critical moment in the battle. Her actions had allowed an entire battalion to withdraw safely to friendly territory, preventing what could easily have become a catastrophic loss of life and equipment. Military analysts studying the engagement afterwards struggled to explain how one wounded soldier had managed to convince an entire enemy brigade that they were facing a coordinated sniper team rather than a single determined woman fighting through blood loss and exhaustion. The reports made clear that her decision to stay behind, made in a matter of seconds under extreme pressure, had fundamentally changed the outcome of the entire engagement. The battalion commander, who had given the original order to withdraw, later admitted, in testimony that would eventually become part of the official record, that he had fully expected to lose the entire retreating force that night. He described watching the radio go silent hour after hour, certain that silence meant the ridge had already fallen, and the enemy brigade was simply closing in behind them. When the counterattack finally arrived and confirmed the ridge had held the entire time, he said it was the first moment in his career he had ever been grateful to be proven wrong about something so completely. Word of her actions eventually reached beyond military circles, drawing interest from reporters and officials eager to turn her story into something more public, something that could be shared and celebrated widely. Rachel refused every request for an interview, declining invitations to ceremonies and press conferences with the same quiet firmness she brought to everything else in her life. When a young officer finally asked her directly why she refused to accept the recognition she had clearly earned, her answer was simple and characteristically brief. "I only did my job," she said, and nothing about her tone suggested she considered the matter open for further discussion. That single sentence, repeated quietly to anyone who pressed her on the subject, became its own kind of legend among the soldiers who had served alongside her, a final confirmation of everything they had always believed about who she truly was. She had never sought glory, and she clearly had no interest in accepting it now that circumstances had made it impossible to avoid entirely. Years later, new recruits training in sniper tactics were still brought to that same ridge overlooking the valley, walking the same ground where Rachel had once made her stand against impossible odds. Instructors would point toward the weathered boulder that had once served as her final defensive position, now marked only by the quiet indifference of returning grass and shifting snow. "Do not only learn how to hit your target," the instructors would tell each new class, their voices carrying the same weight of respect that had followed Rachel's story for years. Many of those recruits would go on to serve in outposts scattered across the world, carrying that single lesson with them long after the details of the story itself had faded into something closer to myth. Some of them would face their own moments of impossible choice, standing at the edge of their own version of that snow-covered ridge, forced to decide in an instant what kind of soldier they intended to become. Few of them would ever face odds as extreme as the ones Rachel had faced that winter, but every one of them carried her example forward regardless, a quiet standard measured not in medals but in the simple willingness to stay when staying cost everything. Learn why someone bleeding out in the snow chooses to stay anyway. They would continue, letting the silence that followed settle over the young soldiers as they absorbed the full meaning behind those words. It was never really about marksmanship in the end, though her skill with a rifle had certainly become the stuff of legend among everyone who studied that engagement afterward. It was about the decision she had made in the space of a single heartbeat, choosing to stand between danger and the people counting on her, regardless of what it might cost her personally. The camera lingers on that quiet mountainside long after the story ends, the wind moving gently through pine branches that have long since forgotten the sound of gunfire. Somewhere beneath the snow, the ground still holds the memory of what happened there. A story passed down not through medals or ceremonies, but through the quiet reverence of soldiers who understood exactly what discipline, sacrifice, and courage could look like when everything else had been stripped away. The legend of Ghost Raven endures not because she sought to be remembered, but because what she did on that ridge became something worth remembering regardless of her own wishes, a symbol carried forward by every soldier who ever heard her story and understood, even briefly, what it truly meant to hold the line.